pass this bill first before the budget is introduced. That is unprecedented in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. I challenge the government to find any precedent for that anywhere in Canada or even in the British Commonwealth. The government has complete control over the date on which the budget is introduced.
Order, please. The Honourable the Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, just in response to the finance critic in the Democratic Party, I would very much like to have put a date on that, but the rules of procedure in this House say that you cannot introduce a budget which we can't introduce a budget where that offshore offset is included as ordinary revenue. So we have to change the legislation to permit that, Mr. Speaker, before the budget can be introduced.
The Honourable House Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, all due respect, that the Minister of Finance can introduce his bill whenever he wants, no matter what is in other legislation.
The Honourable the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I know lots of people have been bantering back and forth, but if we want to get into the actual procedural requirements that are there, Mr. Speaker, is very clear, following our practices and procedures for the Nova Scotia House of Assembly, that indeed, in the efforts of transparency, that's why the Minister brought this standalone bill as enabling legislation, the members of this House also understand, by virtue of the practices and procedures of presenting a budget with legislation that requires a balanced budget. Otherwise, Mr. Speaker, as you would know, being in that chair many times and being a member of government, that indeed you have to follow those practices and procedures, and indeed, to be transparent, the Minister of Finance has laid out a practice. So, Mr. Speaker, that is a matter that will come forward with regards to the steps that are taken. And as the Minister of Finance has indicated, and again, Mr. Speaker, we can come before the House and indeed seek the consent of this House for following procedure. The member from Halifax Fairview is citing procedures, Mr. Speaker. He knows those prescribed procedures, and we're happy to follow them and to be transparent for all Nova Scotians.
Okay. First of all, this is not a point of order. It may be considered as a point of information to the question that was raised. The honourable member from Halifax Fairview has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I mean, the ministers on the government side know very well that that's not a point of order, but I look forward to the government House Leader's contribution to the debate when it's his turn to get up and speak. But in fact, the Minister of Finance is misinterpreting the Provincial Finance Act, Mr. Speaker. He is misinterpreting the Provincial Finance Act, and if he likes, I can send him over a copy of the Provincial Finance Act so he can read it for himself. There is nothing stopping that minister from tabling his budget any day from Monday forward, because the House has gotten its 2 days' notice. There is nothing stopping that minister from tabling his budget, and we ask him to do so, and not to lay down conditions. It is without precedent in this province, in this country, in the Commonwealth of Nations, Mr. Speaker, for any government to lay down a precondition to the tabling of the budget. The control to the tabling of the budget is entirely in that minister's and this government's hands, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, the only conclusion that we in the opposition can come to is that this government—
Order, please. Chair recognizes the Honourable the Minister of Finance.
Speaker, and I do appreciate, and I know that the finance critic for the NDP party is learned and interested in that.
Are we rising on a point of order?
I am, Mr. Speaker. It's
please go ahead.
He has implied that we can table that budget anytime, Mr. Speaker. I just want the people in the House to know that if you will remember back when I introduced the information about the money flowing to the universities through the MLU, I said that we were going to do it concurrently. That was my initial thing. Mr. Speaker, the advice that we have received from constitutional experts that in this particular House we cannot do it.
It is not a point of order. Honourable Minister. The Chair, it's a good point, yes. The Honourable Member from Halifax Fairview has the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. There is no precedent anywhere in this province, at any time in this province, for a government laying down a precondition to the introduction of a budget. There is nothing in the law, there is nothing in the rules that prevents this government from tabling. There's nothing that prevents that minister from tabling his budget on Monday or any day after Monday, Mr. Speaker. And if the members on that side of the House dispute that, then let them point to the provision of the rules or the law. The Provincial Finance Act does not prevent the introduction of a budget as long as it does not have a deficit. Now, is that government saying that the budget that has been drafted has a deficit in it? The minister has said the opposite. He said the opposite today in this House. He said that that budget that will never be introduced, he claims, is balanced. So where in the Provincial Finance Act is the provision that says it can't be tabled? It's not there. It's nonsense, of course, Mr. Speaker. It's nonsense. It's pure nonsense. The only conclusion that the people of the province can come to, Mr. Speaker, is that this government is seeking to avoid the introduction of a budget. It is very difficult for us on this side of the House to understand how the government believes that it can run an election campaign without a budget and blaming the opposition for something that is entirely within the hands of that government. Because, Mr. Speaker, introducing a budget requires a certain amount of discipline which this government has lost. Mr. Speaker, it requires, for example, that the estimates of revenue be audited and certified by the Auditor General. The Auditor General has to review the projections of revenue and say that the assumptions on which they are based are reasonable and that the estimates are based on those assumptions. That is a certain amount of discipline, and if this government triggers an election without introducing a budget, then they don't have to go through the discipline provided by that audit. And, Mr. Speaker, that provision requiring an audit by the Auditor General of the revenue projections is in the Provincial Finance Act for a reason. It is because governments in the past have presented numbers to the House that turned out to be wildly optimistic, Mr. Speaker. And I'm talking about governments particularly in the 1980s, Mr. Speaker. And that's why the provision is there. It is designed to provide some discipline. Mr. Speaker, it is designed to provide disciplines in other ways because the budget documents require the government to lay out the assumptions on which the budget is based. All the assumptions having to do with things like revenue growth, income growth, retail sales, and the like. And the government has to defend those projections, Mr. Speaker. And if this government triggers an election without introducing a budget, it means that they don't have to go through the discipline of putting those numbers on paper and then defending them. They can make whatever claims they want, Mr. Speaker, as part of their campaign platform. Now, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. Chair recognizes the Honourable the Minister of Finance.
For the information of the House, that information has been submitted to the Auditor General.
Is it a point of order? I didn't hear it. Chair recognizes the honourable member from Halifax, Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, this government has lost its discipline, and that is why the government doesn't want to introduce the budget. There is no rule, there is no law, there is no precedent allowing any government to set a precondition to the introduction of a budget, Mr. Speaker. They know it, and we know it, so the only reason available, the only reason that makes sense is that they don't want to introduce a budget because it would require the discipline that they have now lost. They would not require an audit by the Auditor General. They would not be required to state their assumptions in writing. The columns, if they don't introduce a budget, the numbers don't even have to add up, Mr. Speaker. They can make whatever claims they want.
Order, please. On point of order, the Honourable the Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, The honourable member for Halifax Fairview is misleading the House. And there are two aspects he's there. He's talking about the Provincial Finance Act, but Mr. Speaker, he would know full well, or would claim to know full well, the practices and procedures of this House. So what in law and following our practices and procedures are something that I would ask him to look. And if he would like to have the consult of the House leaders to go through the practices and procedures to provide with enlightenment, and through you, Mr. Speaker, I would welcome that opportunity.
Certainly, it's not a point of order. The member from Halifax Fairview has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, if the members of on that side have something to say, that is why we have debates in the House, Mr. Speaker. And this is now the fourth or fifth interruption in 15 minutes, Mr. Speaker, with points of order that they know are not points of order. And, Mr. Speaker, perhaps I could respectfully request that the ministers on that side be reined in a little bit so as not to interrupt my time, Mr. Speaker. I'm here as an elected representative of the people, Mr. Speaker, and if those members have something to say, let them stand up and say it on the record, in Hansard, and the people of the province will judge them, Mr. Speaker. The people of the province will judge them, and they'll judge me. I would never say, Mr. Speaker, that I know or presume to know what the result of the election is. I know, Mr. Speaker, that it is up to the people to decide, and we will present to them a positive alternative to a government without direction and without discipline. And, Mr. Speaker, I and my colleagues know that if we are judged on that basis and found wanting, we will accept that verdict. But, Mr. Speaker, the people will be the final arbiters of whether this government will be allowed to engage in this scheme. This charade of pretending that it's the opposition's fault. The opposition's fault that a budget is not being introduced. Mr. Speaker, this government in 2006 presented a budget, and then before it could be debated, before it came to a vote, they called an election. That didn't go over very well with the voters in my district, Mr. Speaker, and I think the voters more than my district. And now the government has just gone the next step. Last time they introduced a budget and didn't allow it to be debated. This time they're just not going to introduce a budget at all. They are going to trigger an election without the discipline required of introducing a budget and letting Nova Scotians see the plan incomplete and in full. Because, Mr. Speaker, any other government in any other year, this bill that is in front of us now, Bill 240, would be part of the Financial Measures Act. The Financial Measures Act, which is a standard bill that is introduced in this House every year, contains all the legislative provisions that are required to implement the budget. Since the beginning of parliamentary procedure in this province, that's the way things have been done. This year, the government has said, no, things are going to be different. We are going to take this provision out of the Financial Measures Act, lay it in front of the legislature and say, you must pass this first before we do anything else. Mr. Speaker, because they lack the discipline to lead. They lack genuine leadership, Mr. Speaker, because they don't want the people to know the full story about what this government has in store. Mr. Speaker, in order to understand this bill that's in front of us, we have to know something about the background. Where did it come from? Because when I read it earlier, it was obvious that there's no Nova Scotian who can read the bill and know within the four corners of the bill what it is that's going on here. We have to remember, Mr. Speaker, the context of the Atlantic Accords. And John Hamm, the former Premier, started what he called a campaign for fairness back in the period 2000-2001. He wanted to relay to the federal government the idea that Nova Scotians were not the main beneficiaries or the full beneficiaries of the offshore oil and gas that was already being pumped out of the ground, Mr. Speaker. And the historical record will show that that campaign did not go very well at first. Essentially, I remember, for example, Mr. Speaker, a postcard campaign where postcards were to be sent to Ottawa, and I don't think that went particularly well. In fact, the campaign for fairness was essentially moribund for a couple of years. It had essentially died out, and then every provincial premier's best friend, Prime Minister Paul Martin, came to town. Now, Prime Minister Paul Martin was in the midst of an election campaign, and Prime Minister Paul Martin was ready to promise anything to anybody. I think we'll recall that for Prime Minister Paul Martin, everything was a priority. Everything was a top priority. No matter what it was the top priority of his government. And I compliment the government of John Ham for recognizing an opportunity when they saw one. And so they took the campaign for fairness, which up to that point had been fairly ineffective, and they used the prime minister who was willing to promise anything at the beginning of an election campaign and essentially cornered him into promising that he would indeed make things more fair for the people of this province. And Mr. Speaker, once that promise was made, there was no going back. We will recall that there was Prime Minister Paul Martin did actually win that election with a minority Liberal government, and the Atlantic Accords were signed, and as part of that, a cheque was presented to the province of Nova Scotia.
Order, please. The Honourable the Deputy Premier.
Mr. Speaker, would the honourable member permit a question?
Will the honourable member permit a question?
No.
No. Thank you. Chair recognizes the honourable member.
Mr. Speaker, I entertain doubts about the competence of this government, and I entertain hope for a better future, but I do not entertain questions. Mr. Speaker, $830 million were paid in a lump sum cheque to the province of Nova Scotia, and a decision had to be made at that point about what to do with that money. As always, there were many challenges facing the government, and there were many people who said it should be spent on programs. Mr. Speaker, there were many people who said it should be used to cut taxes. There were many people who said it should go on the debt, and of course there were people who said it should be a little bit of each of those things. And we said, and the government of the day said, that that money should go on the debt. It represented a payment to Nova Scotia for revenue that should have been received in the past in respect of non-renewable natural resources, resources that can never be replaced once they're taken out of the ground. And we said, and the government said, that all of that $830 million should go on the debt. And indeed, Mr. Speaker, at the time, John Ham said the following, quote, "The most prudent thing we can do is putting the money on the debt. That will give us a limitless revenue stream of almost $50 million a year that will last well beyond the life of this administration." End of quote. Mr. Speaker, that's worth repeating. It will last well beyond the life of this administration. And as we know, Mr. Speaker, the John Ham administration came to an end in 2006. And here we are only 3 years later with a government proposing to undo that legacy that John Ham himself said would last well beyond the life of his administration. Mr. Speaker, another quotation, this time from the then Finance Minister, the Honourable Peter Christie. I'd like to read to the House, to remind the House what was said at the time that this provision, which is now going to be repealed, was put into the Provincial Finance Act. The Finance Minister of the day said the following, Mr. Speaker, quote, "The province will be committed legally to balance its budget without relying on the year's portion of the $830 million related to the offshore agreement brought into revenue this year. The province will be required to maintain that balance throughout the year. As and when we reduce the debt, annual interest charges will be lowered, making the province more attractive to financial markets and providing us with greater flexibility to respond to the issues facing Nova Scotians." End of quote. Mr. Speaker, that is from Hansard on May the 3rd, 2005, the then Finance Minister, the Honourable Peter Christie. Mr. Speaker, the implication of that is that if we undo what was done in 2005, that it will make us less attractive to financial markets and provide us with less flexibility to deal with the challenges facing Nova Scotians. And yet that is precisely what this government is proposing to do. Now, Mr. Speaker, let me put this bill in front of us in further context, since, as we know, just from reading it, it is impossible to understand the implications of it. What it does is delete a certain section of the Provincial Finance Act that was added to that act in May 2005. Now, I find it somewhat ironic, Mr. Speaker, that the section of the Provincial Finance Act in which this clause is found is headed Government Accountability. Now, these provisions are designed to ensure that our government is fully accountable with the way it spends the people's money. And it includes, Mr. Speaker, the balanced budget requirement. It includes a requirement that these funds from the offshore accords be applied to the debt. And it does other things as well, Mr. Speaker. It is ironic that on the eve, apparently, of a provincial election, this government is going to delete clauses from a section entitled Government Accountability. Mr. Speaker, there could not be a clearer sign that we are, with this government, moving backwards, not forwards. Because let's be clear about what's happening here, Mr. Speaker. When that $830 million was delivered to Nova Scotia, it was on a cash basis applied directly to the debt, directly and immediately. But the government had an accounting problem because we don't do the books of the province on a cash basis anymore. That practice, which didn't reveal the true state of the province's finances, thankfully died out in the 1990s. And Mr. Speaker, I'm not usually free with my compliments to the Liberal Party, but I've said it before and I'll say it again. It was the Liberal Party under the former Finance Minister, the Honourable Don Down, who began the move towards accounting on the basis of generally accepted accounting principles. Because the Liberals inherited a financial mess from the Conservative government in 1993, and they struggled for the next 6 years to try to come to terms with that. And I will compliment the Liberal Party that they finally started coming to grips with the fact that the books of the province did not reveal the true state of the province's finances, and they started the move to generally accepting accounting principles, a move which was finished under the Honourable Neil LeBlanc and former Premier John Hamm. Mr. Speaker, but we don't account for things on a cash basis, and that meant that when the $830 million was received, the government had an accounting problem, because the way it works is that money is attributed to the year in which it is that is deemed to have been compensation for. And the amounts of money, I think, Mr. Speaker, will be of interest to the House. For 2005-06, the sum of money was $57,100,000. For 2006-07, it was $93 million. For 07-08, it was $189 million. And now we get to the bit, Mr. Speaker, that the government wants to delete. For fiscal year 2008-09, $207 million. For fiscal year 2009-010, the fiscal year in which we are currently, $151 million. And for the fiscal year 2010-2011, $92 million. Now, Mr. Speaker, the portions of this act that this government is asking us to delete adds up to $450 million. This government, without presenting a budget to explain what they're going to do with the money, without presenting any rationale for why this now today is the right thing to do, Mr. Speaker, without any plan, without any budget, wants us to essentially approve a blank check for $450 million. And Mr. Speaker, That is our children's money. That is our grandchildren's money. And I don't think anybody in this House needs to be told that lesson, because today, in 2009, we are paying and paying and paying for mistakes made by the Conservative government 20 and 30 years ago. And mistakes that are made today will not be paid by us. They will be paid by the people who are sitting in this House 20 and 30 years from now, who are making decisions about themselves and their families and their children, Mr. Speaker. We know in Nova Scotia all too well the burden of excessive debt. We have suffered under it long enough, Mr. Speaker. And nobody, Mr. Speaker, should lecture a New Democrat about debt and deficit. Tommy Douglas, the greatest Canadian, was a Premier of Saskatchewan for 17 years and balanced the books every single year. And Tommy Douglas used to say to people, if you get into debt, you are handing your future over to bankers and bondholders. Mr. Speaker, he knew that, and we know that, and this government is expecting us to sign a blank check to them for $450 million. Now, essentially what they're doing, again, Mr. Speaker, if I could speak on a cash basis, that $830 million already went on the debt, so we're talking about accounting. The government wants to re-borrow $450 million so they can use it on day-to-day spending. Now, those non-renewable resources, Mr. Speaker, are a legacy for us and for our children and for our grandchildren. That money must go on the debt. It must stay on the debt. It is the only responsible thing to do. In the 2005 debate, Mr. Speaker, the 2005 reply to the budget, April 28th in Hansard, I said, as the opposition finance critic, quote, we support the fact that the offshore accord payment is going to pay down the debt. That is the only responsible thing to do. End of quote. It was the only responsible thing to do then. It is the only responsible thing to do today, Mr. Speaker. That is what we mean by a principle, something that you keep even when times are tough. This government, since being elected in 1999, has surfed the wave of ever-increasing revenues, Mr. Speaker, and despite their rhetoric, has never had to make truly difficult decisions. This year, for the first time, they've had to make difficult decisions because of the state of the economy, Mr. Speaker. And what have they done? What have they done? They've tried to change the rules. Now, I'm mindful of the fact, Mr. Speaker, it's Stanley Cup playoff time, so I'll use a hockey analogy. What the government is trying to do, because they can't get the puck in the net according to the existing rules, is get the net moved closer to their own end. And by saying to the opposition that you have to pass this or there'll be no budget, they're trying to say to the opposition, not only have we moved the net closer to our end of the ice, but we're telling you, you got to pull the goalie. And then maybe they'll get the puck in the net, Mr. Speaker. It's wrong in hockey, and it's wrong in government. What we need... There's a minute left in the game. Not Boston, though, not Boston. What we need right now is genuine leadership, not a government that's trying to change the rules. Mr. Speaker, this government, if it were showing genuine leadership on this issue, would have worked closely with the opposition parties to deal with the economic crisis that is facing this economy and all economies in Canada and around the world. And instead, Mr. Speaker, they have resolutely resisted releasing or sharing any information about the state of the province's finances, about the state of the economy. And, Mr. Speaker, I'll add this. The Provincial Finance Act requires a quarterly update The last one was delivered at the end of December. The next one, when's the next one due? What does the Provincial Finance Act say? When is it due? It's due at the same day the budget is tabled. But if there's no budget, there's no economic update. And so this government is going to allow itself to go into an election which they're triggering with no budget and no formal economic update to let the people of the province know what the state of the finances is, Mr. Speaker. One can only conclude that that is a deliberate choice of the government, so that on the campaign trail they can make whatever claims they want, because there is no government document available to contradict them. Mr. Speaker, let me give another example of information that they should have released and have not. And that is when the Minister of Finance talks about the lowering debt to GDP ratio, Mr. Speaker. Here's the problem with the lowering debt to GDP ratio, Mr. Speaker. It is a claim backed up by no government document. And as we saw, Mr. Speaker, in the Economic Development Committee, it depends on a number of wild assumptions which no serious economist believes are going to happen, rates of growth in the economy in future years that nobody expects will happen, rates of growth 2 years from now, Mr. Speaker, that have to hit 9% in order for their debt to GDP ratio claims to be met. Now, Mr. Speaker, at that Economic Development Committee meeting, I asked the Deputy Minister of Finance to submit to the committee the document, the government's analysis that justified those wild claims. She said she would check with the minister. She said she was muzzled. She said she would check with the minister, Mr. Speaker, and we got a letter the other day from the Deputy Minister who said that she had passed the request on to the minister. So, Mr. Speaker, here on the floor of this House, let me repeat the request. If that minister is going to stand up and make claims about the debt to GDP ratio, let's see the documents that back it up. Let's see the assumptions. Let's see what they are. Let's see where they came from. Let's see how it is that the government can claim that 2 years from now the economy will grow by 9% per year. Because if it doesn't, Mr. Speaker, then the debt to GDP ratio claimed by the government will not be met. It is just another example of how this government makes claims but will not present the documents to back them up. That minister over there, Mr. Speaker, claims that his budget is balanced. Well, then bring in the budget. Let's see the budget. There is nothing stopping that minister from bringing in the budget on Monday or any day after Monday. If the budget is balanced, as he says, there is no restriction in the Provincial Finance Act to its being tabled. There is no restriction at all. But the minister makes the claim, but then won't bring in the document to substantiate it. Whether it's on debt to GDP ratio or whether the budget is balanced or not, he makes claims and won't back them up. And it appears, Mr. Speaker, that the government is going to trigger an election without bringing forward any documents to substantiate its claims. It appears, if the government is to be believed, that there will be no budget. There will be no fiscal update. None of the documents backing up the government's claims in the infrastructure plan have been tabled, despite the request having gone in, and it's a request that I'm repeating today, Mr. Speaker. Instead, we have a government that is appealing to fear and division. Mr. Speaker, there is no government in Canada that has run out of money, Mr. Speaker, ever. Because every single Provincial Finance Act has provisions to prevent that from happening. And the Minister of Finance and the Premier know that very well. There is no government in Canada that needs to run out of money unless it is pure incompetence, Mr. Speaker. Because the Provincial Finance Act has provisions that allows the government to govern, that allows the government to do what it needs to do to manage the economy, to run the government, to do what needs to be done. And what we say to the government is, you're the government. Govern. That's your job. That's what the job the people of Nova Scotia have entrusted you with. And instead, we get the minister saying, we've run out of money. It's not the case, Mr. Speaker. The minister is misinformed at best. Mr. Speaker, to say that projects will be lost, as the government House Leader says, is municipal infrastructure projects will be gone if the budget doesn't pass, is simply, Mr. Speaker, misinformation. And there are two possibilities here, Mr. Speaker, neither of them very appealing. Mr. Speaker, the first possibility is that the government doesn't understand provincial finances. The other possibility is that they do understand provincial finances and are misleading the public about the true state of affairs, Mr. Speaker. Neither of those is a very appealing prospect. There is no reason in the world, why any government needs to run out of money. That is why the special warrants procedure is in the Provincial Finance Act, has been in the Provincial Finance Act for decades, is in every single Provincial Finance Act across the country, Mr. Speaker. Who was the last government to use a special warrant? Well, the government House Leader says they can't be used when they're in session. That's because the expectation is that when the House is in session, a budget will be brought in. So on this side of the House, we say to you, bring in the budget. Bring in the budget. We are ready. If this government brings in the budget on Monday, we will be here. We will be in our seats. We will be ready to debate it. We reject any attempt by the government to set false preconditions. Mr. Speaker, to set conditions that any other government would have handled in a different way, in a better way, by including this provision in a Financial Measures Act, Mr. Speaker. Instead, they are looking for a blank check for $450 million, and all they're doing is appealing to fear and division, Mr. Speaker. Fear and division, setting one group of Nova Scotians against another, setting one half of a county against another, setting rural people against people in the metro area, Mr. Speaker, setting people against each other. We are, Mr. Speaker, less than 1 million people on the edge of a continent. We must work together, Mr. Speaker. We must work together. We must work as a province, Mr. Speaker. We must work as a region. We are a small region in a small country beside the largest economy in the world. If we do not work together, Mr. Speaker, things fall apart. And yet we have a government that will not introduce a budget, will not introduce a plan, will not release information that will allow Nova Scotians to judge them on their record, Mr. Speaker. Instead, we have a government that is appealing to fear. And although there are many instances of that over the last few weeks, the worst one was this morning in the House. That minister, and that minister knows what he said, to try and draw a link between this bill and that forest fire is shameful. That minister this morning said, Mr. Speaker, that the government could save money by keeping the helicopters on the ground. I think that minister is going to be held accountable for that statement this morning, Mr. Speaker. That is an example of the kind of fear and division that this Premier and this minister and this government are resorting to because they have nothing left, Mr. Speaker. They have nothing left. We are ready, Mr. Speaker, if it comes to it, to go to the people and let the people decide. We do not believe that an election has to happen. We do not say, we will not say, that we cannot accept a budget that we haven't seen. But nor, Mr. Speaker, will we give in to a government that sets down false preconditions, a precondition that seems designed to permit them to hit the campaign trail without a budget, without a plan, without a forecast update, without any information on which the people can judge them and decide what they're going to do. Mr. Speaker, we will not allow the government to change the rules under these circumstances. We will not allow the government to move the nets, Mr. Speaker. We are going to meet as a caucus on Monday afternoon to make our final decision. We know that this is a weighty decision, but if the government is determined to fall on this bill, we will make our decision. We will make our decision according to what's in the best interest of all the people of the province, Mr. Speaker. It is not necessary that that should happen. What should happen is that this government should bring in its budget. What should happen is that Bill 240 should form part of the Financial Measures Act. That is what should happen, Mr. Speaker. But if they're not willing to do that, Mr. Speaker, we're ready. We offer genuine leadership. We offer a better deal, Mr. Speaker, and we will let the people decide.
Thank you. The chair recognizes the Honourable, the Leader of the Liberal Party.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to join debate on 240. Thanks very much. It's amazing when you look back to 2005 and the work that took place by Dr. Ham and Prime Minister Martin and the celebration that we had as a province. I remember the picture of Dr. Ham, I think it was leaving the Red Room carrying the check and him making sure that no one else was going to get their hands on it. And I would dare say he probably still has that check somewhere. And it was a great day for Nova Scotia. I remember the leader of our party acknowledged that and acknowledged the contribution that and the path that Dr. Ham was moving forward with in terms of putting that offset payment on the debt. On October 31st, last year, Mr. Speaker, I asked this government to come together and work with us as a party to try to help to build a plan for it, to help move a plan so that we could help mitigate the economic challenges that not only Nova Scotia is facing, but provinces across our country and indeed countries globally. And they refused to accept that invitation. Mr. Speaker, I was very clear in the following months that I believed that the offset payment for last year was to be paid directly on the debt of the province of Nova Scotia, and that I was not willing to participate in changing legislation that would retroactively change the law. I had cleared and said to Nova Scotians that I would be more than willing to entertain the idea of changing that legislation as we go forward, to allowing that offset payment to be used in these tough economic times. But, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians themselves have been faced with difficult times. And changing the law, even in these difficult times, to go retroactive doesn't make sense to them. They have a hard time understanding when a government, at the end of the fiscal year, takes $256 million and offloads it onto this year's budget for post-secondary education costs. And it's not new money, Mr. Speaker. It's to cover this fiscal year's operating costs. They have a hard time understanding why we need to change the law to bring about $105 million back in to allow them to balance the books. The Minister of Finance rose and said, without this change, we would have a deficit budget. Any party, whoever's leading this province, would have to provide a deficit budget. Mr. Speaker, I contend we already have a deficit budget, and it's the one that was last year. Because the legislation that they're looking to change is retroactive. Without that $105 million, your budget will not be balanced. That's coming from your own government. That's the rationale for this. Mr. Speaker, when we participated in the budget process last year, we worked with this government to try to provide what was a balanced approach in a minority government. Lo and behold, during these tough economic times, instead of reining in the expenditures that are going on, they decide to change the legislation, the law. How many Nova Scotians would like to, if they found themselves in a tough situation, would like to change the law retroactively? Probably all of us. And let me be clear, our caucus was more than prepared to go from this date forward in changing that offset payment. But we said then, and I'll say it again, we are not willing to participate in going retroactively. If this continues and the government wants to bring this to a vote, our caucus will not be supporting that legislation. We have said from a very long time that we would not be supporting that legislation. Told Nova Scotians, I told the Premier, and I told Nova Scotians on many occasions, I am not, will not, now or ever participate in changing the law retroactively. I was more than willing to participate on going forward. Last October, I was more than willing to sit down with this government and help to try to build a plan on how we went forward. I hear the Premier wanting to yell across the call now. He should have had a conversation in October. If he wanted to have the conversation, we should have had it in October. I will not, and our caucus will not. As a matter of fact, Mr. Premier, we're going to cut the small business tax. We're going to cut the small business tax, Mr. Premier, from 5 to 1%. We're going to engage the men and women in this province who are growing the economy. We're going to engage the men and women who are growing this economy, and we're going to engage them in a way that allow them to create sustainable jobs all across this province.
Be a man and call an election, Rodney.
Mr. Speaker, I listened to the Minister of Finance speak today about the federal dollars that are on the table. The great news yesterday was that the federal minister for Atlantic Canada said his dollars would be available whenever. And I don't believe the check is made out to the Conservative government. I believe it's made out to the people of Nova Scotia. And as I said yesterday, Mr. Speaker, it's time to make a decision. It's time to make a decision.
Order, please. The chair recognizes the Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker,
On a point of order? On a
point of order, yes.
Point of order.
And the Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party implied that the federal money would flow forever. Mr. Speaker, it's well known that there's a 24-month time limit on that.
Thank you for the point of information and not a point of order. The chair recognizes the Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party.
24-hour time limit on you, too.
The Honourable Leader has the floor, and I certainly would encourage all members
I want to tell the Minister of Finance that I agree with his analogy about the 24 months. I saw that as well. An election will take 30 days. That'll leave another 23 months for whoever the people of Nova Scotia decide should govern the province to work in formal plan go forward. Mr. Speaker, we as a party have always been and will always willing to look and entertain their budget if they're willing to bring it to the House. Mr. Speaker, I don't know if it's possible. I've heard two different sides of this argument, quite frankly. One says this bill has to pass in order for the next one to come forward. I don't know if that's necessary or if that's how it works. I'll tell you what I do know is that our caucus will not be supporting this legislation. So if this is the piece of legislation that they want to use as a confidence vote, then I don't think we should waste the time of the people of Nova Scotia any longer. If the New Democrats need to wait for Monday to decide what they're going to do, then perhaps we should give them to Monday. But we decided many months ago that we will not participate in changing the laws of our province to retroactively bail out the mismanagement of this province. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the Honourable the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I want to speak to the bill, Mr. Speaker, at this particular point in time. Mr. Speaker, I do want to point out that all members on all sides of the House are extremely eager and interested to see roads and bridges across Nova Scotia improved and in many cases replaced. This budget, Mr. Speaker, as perhaps you would know, in terms of the capital program for highway projects, is the biggest in this province history. And we have had, of course, good cooperation from the federal government on many initiatives and on many fronts. And Prime Minister Stephen Harper and the Honourable Peter MacKay, yes, have worked tirelessly on behalf of the federal stimulus package. Now, Mr. Speaker, I do want to point out that when we came to government in 1999, the capital budget for the Department of Transportation was $44 million. This government recognized a huge infrastructure deficit, and over the last little more than 10 years, we've increased that budget significantly to nearly 6 times what it was back in 1999, Mr. Speaker. And we do have, in fact, a very ambitious road building program planned for the upcoming construction season. Mr. Speaker, a few short months ago, I had the privilege of attending the Nova Scotia Road Builders Annual General Meeting. I do know that some members opposite were at that meeting as well, and the road builders pointed out that during this time of a weakened economy that it's very important to make investments in our infrastructure, because those are long-term investments, and as well they will put people to work. And you know, in my constituency, like constituencies right across Nova Scotians, there are people looking for job opportunities. And Mr. Speaker, as you would know, as you represent the riding of Clare, that job opportunities also mean economic benefits to the communities, to the province, and of course, Mr. Speaker, that's extremely important. Now, the honourable member, colleague, Minister of Finance, referenced that we did work extremely tirelessly on budget preparation. We examined revenues and expenditures ad nauseum, and it was a challenge. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And with this piece of legislation, we made a very difficult decision. And that decision, Mr. Speaker, was to basically defer the offshore offset, Mr. Speaker. Now, in doing that, we believe that we were able to sustain and protect many programs that are essential to Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. And I would challenge members opposite to rise in their feet and tell us how they would make up that difference, how they would find that monetary to provide the programs that Nova Scotians have come to accept, expect, and deserve. Mr. Speaker, it's extremely important. It's fine to stand in the legislature, and Mr. Speaker, I don't claim to be different than anybody else in this House. Sometimes we stand in our place and do make statements that are deemed to be quite political. But today, in front of Nova Scotia, we are discussing very serious business, Mr. Speaker. We're talking about the Nova Scotia economy. We're talking about people. We're talking about families. We're talking about people waiting to get to work, Mr. Speaker. That's what we're talking about here today. But members opposite choose to play politics, Mr. Speaker. Choose to play politics, Mr. Speaker. I think Nova Scotia deserves better than that, Mr. Speaker. In fact, just a short while ago, I overheard a media scrum where, in fact, the leader of the NDP stood in his place and said he'd never seen such hyperbole in all his life. He had never seen the like. the rhetoric that's going on, and here we are talking about a very serious, significant piece of legislation. And Nova Scotians out there are taking this very, very seriously. And I would say to members opposite that you will rue the day. You will rue the day that you stop Nova Scotians in their tracks from the recovery that they find so fundamentally necessary to move forward on, Mr. Speaker. It is extremely important, Mr.
Order, please. The Leader of the Liberal Party on a point of order.
Order.
Point of order, please do.
It is a very serious problem. It's why we shouldn't be the last legislature in Canada to be sitting. We should have been the first.
Certainly not a point of order. The chair recognizes the Honourable Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable colleague yesterday referenced that, in fact, the Liberals in the past have brought forward budgets that in fact were later dated than in fact we plan to bring in our budget forward, Mr. Speaker. So really, I guess it's okay for the pot to call the kettle black here today, but Mr. Speaker, the point of the matter is that it's Nova Scotians that we're talking about. It's the Nova Scotia economy, Mr. Speaker, that is weakened. We're not immune from the difficulties that New Brunswick, that Quebec, that Newfoundland, that Ontario, that Manitoba, that Saskatchewan, that Alberta, British Columbia, the territories, all the states, we're not immune from the difficulties that those jurisdictions are facing, Mr. Speaker. And in fact, we did work with our federal colleagues, Mr. Speaker, to come up with some much-needed relief programs and a budget to help Nova Scotia through these very difficult times. And, Mr. Speaker, the bill, the act to permit the expenditure of surpluses generated by offshore offset revenues, Mr. Speaker, again, was brought forward after a lot of deliberation, after hours and hours and hours and days and days and weeks and weeks. And yes, Mr. Speaker, a few months did go by, but Mr. Speaker, we believe that we have it right for Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. We believe that this piece of legislation that is fundamental to the budget going forward is the right thing to do, Mr. Speaker, at this particular point in time. The Minister of Finance pointed out, Mr. Speaker, how difficult a decision it was. So I would say to members opposite, and ask them to stand in their place and tell Nova Scotians how they plan to provide those programs that Nova Scotians deserve. How do you plan to do it, Mr. Speaker? I asked the people opposite, how do you plan to do it? So, Mr. Speaker, what hospital are you going to close, Mr. Speaker? What school are you not going to build? What road are you not going to pave? What bridge are you not going to build? Stand up and tell Nova Scotia,
order, please.
Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. Order, please. Order, please.
Nova Scotia, but
order, please. Order, please. Thank you. I don't know about the honourable members, but I can tell all of you it's extremely hard for the speaker up here to listen to the member that has the floor. So maybe I could suggest that we try to tone it down and hear what the honourable member has to say. So instead of having to shout, across the floor, maybe we could allow the honourable member the courtesy to be heard. Thank you very much. The chair recognizes the Honourable Minister of Transportation, Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I was saying, Mr. Speaker, when we came to office, I can speak from experience in my riding, the beautiful Colchester-Musquedoboit Valley, Mr. Speaker, by coincidence or more likely by political design, we couldn't get a teaspoon of asphalt. We couldn't get a teaspoon of asphalt, Mr. Speaker, from the members opposite when they were the government of the day. But, Mr. Speaker, today we can stand in our place and say that every riding across Nova Scotia where the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal has responsibility has received new asphalt, has received gravel, have received guardrails, and have received brush cutting. Every riding that we are responsible for. That's how fair this government is, Mr. Speaker. That's how fair this government is, Mr. Speaker. And sometimes you have to kind of quietly laugh to yourself, or perhaps not so quietly, when you hear especially the members of the opposition stand in their place, Mr. Speaker, and try to make all these grandiose promises. They make all these promises to Nova Scotia, and then when the government holds them accountable for those promises, when the government accuses them of being what they are, risky, Mr. Speaker, then they seem to get quite excited and say, oh my gosh, they're attacking us, they're attacking us, they're pounding us, Mr. Speaker. Well, what we're asking members opposite, all members opposite, stand in your place and please tell Nova Scotians what programs are you going to cut? If not, how high are you going to raise the taxes? Tell Nova Scotia. We've told Nova Scotia where we're going. We've been clear. We've been upfront. We've been sincere. The Minister of Finance brought forward a very reasonable piece of legislation for these very extraordinary times, Mr. Speaker. You know that these are extraordinary times, Mr. Speaker. You've been around the House longer than most, if I must say, with all respect. And, Mr. Speaker, and we wish you well in whatever future endeavours that you may take. But the fact of the matter is, you know yourself, Mr. Speaker, that these are challenging times. The economy is weakened. There's no doubt about that. And again, if you look at our neighbours to the north in New Brunswick, they had to make some extremely unpopular measures. They had to take some unpopular measures. And, you know, we commend Premier Sean Graham and his government. They looked at things in a way that they believed was in the best interest of New Brunswickers. We, in turn, have looked at things in a way that we believe is in the best interest of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm proud of the record that this government has established. You know, in 10 short years, Mr. Speaker, we've came forward with 7 balanced budgets, Mr. Speaker, and we've done that through some difficult times, and we've done that through some reasonably good times when revenues, in fact, have increased. But what we've always tried to do is keep in mind the needs of Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. So again, that's why more than ever we need clarity. We need clarity as to where the Liberals stand. We need clarity as to where the NDP stand on this very important issue, Mr. Speaker. You know, you can sit in your place and make light of it, but this is serious business. This is the people's business, Mr. Speaker. This is the people's business. And you know, Mr. Speaker, my concern is that they really don't have a plan as to where they're going to make up the difference that's contained in this piece of legislation. And they should be honest, and they should be upfront and tell Nova Scotians, if they're not going to raise taxes, what programs are you going to cut? It's basically that simple. If you're not going to raise taxes, what programs are you going to cut? If you're not going to raise taxes, tell Nova Scotians. Tell Nova Scotians. And you know there's not one of them, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'll try not to raise my voice. Mr. Speaker, I think, but Mr. Speaker, you know, Mr. Speaker, we value the work that Nova Scotians do. We value the work that Nova Scotians do for this government in every department, Mr. Speaker. You know, Mr. Speaker, we've made commitments to Nova Scotia workers, and we'll continue to do that. We've been upfront, we've been sincere and honest, Mr. Speaker. And there has been consultations, Mr. Speaker. There has been discussions, Mr. Speaker. But you know, Mr. Speaker, I would defy one member opposite to go out and talk to the Nova Scotia road builders and tell them that, in fact, you're going to put the brakes on the construction season. Go out and tell them. Go out and tell them. I'm asking you to go tell them in Cape Breton Centre. Go and tell them. Go and tell them out in Sackville-Cobequid. Go out and tell them in Timberley Prospect. Go out and tell them in Shelburne. Go out and tell them in Pictou East. Go out and tell them in Dartmouth. Go out and tell them. Go out and tell them. Mr. Speaker, don't forget Halifax. No, we don't forget Halifax. Yes, Mr. Speaker. Why won't the NDP stand up and be honest with Nova Scotians? What are they hiding, Mr. Speaker? What are the NDP hiding today, Mr. Speaker? We are honest. We're sincere. We've brought out a bill. We've brought out a piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, and we are sharing it with members opposite. And, Mr. Speaker, all they will tell us is that they won't support it. But what they're not saying is how they're going to provide them programs. How are you going to pave those roads? How are you going to fix those bridges? How are you going to build those hospitals? How are you going to build those schools? How are you going to keep the government employees working? What's your plan? You simply have none. come stand in your place. If you do, stand in your place and tell Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, tell Nova Scotians, you know, we've seen the assumptions, Mr. Speaker. We've done the due diligence. We've looked hard and we've looked long. And, Mr. Speaker, we've brought forward what I think the Minister of Finance has described as a very difficult and challenging piece of legislation. We acknowledge that. We acknowledge that, Mr. Speaker. And if the economy wasn't weakened, we probably wouldn't have to do this, Mr. Speaker. But you know one thing, we do have a plan. We have a go-forward plan. And here we are at the start of the construction season, and members opposite are willing, it seems from the articulation opposite, they're willing to put Nova Scotians in jeopardy. They're willing to play politics. They're willing to play politics at this time, Mr. Speaker. And it's most. And the member opposite from Halifax Atlantic got on her pins today, Mr. Speaker, and brought forward a piece of, brought forward a resolution, Mr. Speaker, where she accused the government over on this side of the House of risking public safety. You have a look, and I think the other speaker, Mr. Speaker, is going to review that piece of hen scratching, Mr. Speaker, because that was written on the fly. But I can tell you this, Mr. Speaker, that piece of legislation is apparently supported by the official opposition. Unbelievable that the leader of the opposition would support something like that. When you talk about rhetoric and garbage, Mr. Speaker, I've never seen anything like that in going on nearly 16 years, Mr. Speaker. And when you have a look at it, I'm sure you will concur. It's absolutely disgraceful that something like that would come forward from the member of Halifax Atlantic and be supported, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we're talking about Glace Bay.
Order, please. The honourable member from Glace Bay. On a point of order?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. No, I know the minister wasn't talking about Glace Bay. We don't have any provincial roads there, so
order, please.
Thanks for nothing.
Order, please. Order,
Mr.
please.
Speaker, just on a point of order.
Thank you. Please do.
A member of this House deserves the respect that they should be shown. Whether or not a member from the NDP caucus today got up and stood, I don't think they should be referred to as standing up on their pins, nor do I think that their writing should be referred to as hen scratching. And I think that shows a level of disrespect that we should not accept in this House, Mr. Speaker. And I would ask the minister to apologize to the member.
Thank you for raising that point. I understand that the resolution is being looked at. It was noted earlier, I believe, by a government member asking the Speaker to take a look at the resolution that was tabled. So thank you for bringing back to our attention. The Chair recognizes the Honourable Minister of Transportation, Infrastructure, Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, this resolution, as I indicated earlier, was written in, it appears at least that it was written very hastily. And I don't mean any disrespect to hens, or in fact, I don't mean any disrespect to the honourable member opposite. I've simply said that it's a firm, Mr. Speaker, that expression is used, has been used, Mr. Speaker, home on the farm. It has been used. But let me say this. When the honourable member, I'll rephrase it this way, when the honourable member took her place in the legislature and presented this barely legible piece, a resolution, Mr. Speaker, I did ask through the Speaker to have it examined. So if in fact I did offend anybody or any farm animal, I apologize for that.
Order, please. The Chair recognizes the House Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I wonder if the minister in his bluster really meant to describe a female member of our caucus as a hen.
Thank you. I didn't hear that. Before I recognize the Honourable Minister, I will point out to the House Leader of the New Democratic Party that I will check Hansard and I will report back to the House in a future date. Thank you. Chair recognizes the Minister of Transportation, Infrastructure, Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do want to move forward. And Mr. Speaker, the Department of Agriculture and the farmers in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, some of us would maintain are the backbone of many, many communities. Mr. Speaker, this government has invested more in agriculture than, on a per capita basis, than any province right across Canada. And those programs that were crafted and put together were done in consultation with the agriculture community, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and would we like to do more? Of course we would like to do more. Do we have the capacity to do more? It is difficult, Mr. Speaker, from time to time to find the necessary funding to help our friends and our neighbours in the agriculture community. But, Mr. Speaker, it shouldn't be lost on anybody opposite that this government has invested more in agriculture than any province right across Canada on a per capita basis. And we've done that, Mr. Speaker, in cooperation with the Nova Scotia Federation of Agriculture. And I know that it has been difficult times for the hog producers. There's no doubting that. There's no disputing that. But, Mr. Speaker, there comes a time, Mr. Speaker, when in fact, Mr. Speaker, you have to take the difficult decisions. And on this side of the chamber, we're not afraid to make the difficult decisions, Mr. Speaker. And this is a very difficult decision, you know, and I know that the ag critic for the NDP has said from time to time that, you know, his party would do this and do that. I've been in the same audience, Mr. Speaker. I've witnessed some of the boasts and some of the promises that have been made, and that's fine. In fact, I can understand that we all would like to do that stuff. But if you don't have the funding, Mr. Speaker, if you don't have the funding, it's extremely difficult to keep those promises, Mr. Speaker. So perhaps he would like to, you know, have a look, Mr. Speaker, at some of the difficulties and some of the challenges that members opposite are facing when they bring forward pieces of legislation like this act to permit the expenditure of surpluses generated by offshore offset revenues, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, I do again call on members opposite to stand up in their place. And again, Mr. Speaker, I think it is incumbent upon the leaders of both parties opposite to tell Nova Scotians what programs would they in fact cut. If in fact they're not going to raise taxes, Mr. Speaker. We've seen the assumptions, we've done the work, we've done the due diligence, we've looked again tirelessly at this, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you know, and you have to be honest, and you have to be upfront, and you have to be sincere. We've brought forward, we believe, a piece of legislation that in fact has been a challenge for us to put together, but we've brought it forward, and we would like to ask members opposite to give it every consideration so we can move forward with a budget, Mr. Speaker, that is so important to Nova Scotians. It is important to the agriculture community. It is important to the fishery. It is important to the forestry. It is important to the truckers. It is important to the road builders. It is important to Nova Scotia. There's social programs contained, Mr. Speaker, in the budget through community services, through health, through education, many, many social programs. Mr. Speaker, they're your neighbor. They're my neighbor. They're everybody's neighbor, Mr. Speaker. People are counting on this place, in fact, Mr. Speaker, to provide leadership. We've brought forward, we believe, a piece of legislation that is very, very necessary to assist Nova Scotians as they move forward, Mr. Speaker. And yes, absolutely, to maintain those programs that are so essential to Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. But again, Mr. Speaker, we haven't seen any member opposite stand in their place and tell Nova Scotians how they are going to provide those programs without raising taxes. And, Mr. Speaker, you have to be accountable. So we're asking you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you know, I've had the opportunity to serve in opposition for, I believe it was 6 or 7 years. And, Mr. Speaker, in opposition, we, in fact, made the government accountable, Mr. Speaker. We held their feet to the fire on many, many issues, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you know, of course we stand up for our constituents, Mr. Speaker. We always have. But you know, Mr. Speaker, members opposite, they try to divert attention, they try to break rabbit tracks, but Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, we're asking the member opposite to stand up and be accountable. You know, in Richmond County, they have to be accountable. They have to be accountable in the Valley. They have to be accountable in Glace Bay. But we have We have people struggling out there. We have in our resource-based sector, people are struggling in those resource-based sectors, Mr. Speaker, and we have a piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, here that we believe is most supportable, and it's understandable in these challenging times. Our economy is weak, and I'm asking members opposite to please tell Nova Scotia how you plan on providing those programs that Nova Scotians come to expect and come to deserve, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for your indulgence.
Thank you. Chair will recognize the honourable member from Cape Breton Nova on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to bring attention to your gallery today, Mr. Speaker. As you well know, the community of Whitney Pier has produced many distinguished citizens, like Clotilda Yatmachuk in the Order of Canada. In your gallery today, we have her son, Kenny Douglas, a young lawyer here in Halifax from my community in Whitney Pier, who's been living here for many years now. I'd like Kenny to rise and get a warm welcome from the House. Thank you.
Thank you. The chair recognizes the honourable member from Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, like my colleague from Halifax Fairview, before I get into the real text of my debate on Bill 240, I also want to put on the record the high esteem and regard I had for the late Honourable Michael Baker. Michael and I came into this House together in '98 and had worked on WCB Select Committee, and that's where I got to know him personally. And I can really say that when you got to know Michael Baker, you knew somebody that was beyond reproach, that was solid, that you could have a very, very feisty argument with. But at the end of the day, the sword was laid down. And this House and this province is much better to be served, that we were served by him, and certainly, in my estimation, his presence will be greatly missed. And to the Cindy and the boys, I want to take this opportunity in a public way to give my condolences. Mr. Speaker, and on that line, you know, I also have a great deal of respect for the Minister of Finance. Him and I, again, were infamous class of '98, I guess, and we understand these things. But and I've got to say, the same line of respect that we have got really loud with one another from time to time over these many years, and we can probably tell stories about Bill 68. But the fact of it was, at the end of the day, when we took that breath, that you understood that it wasn't personal, that we may have been looking at a situation maybe through different ends of the lens, if you will, but we still, I think, really did it because our vision of Nova Scotia, and it happened to be different, but that was it. But on 240, this is I don't think we'll be as I won't be as vitriolic about this bill. It probably was about Bill 68. But what I really am amazed at with Bill 240 is that all this talk about consultation, that, you know, about working together, and that, you know, that this party's looking to run out for an election, and these folks are you know, just lathering to do this and to do that. But the government really didn't show true leadership. And, you know, last we met 5 months ago, and we were talking about the economic perils that were coming towards us. There was really no reaction. There was, and as the House recessed and the economic situation, you know, got worse and worse and worse, there was at no point did the sitting government in a minority House take the time and say, you know what, we need many, many heads and many points of view to help us get out of here. And so what they do now, instead of doing that and doing the responsible thing at that time, and to say, put partisanship, as they said earlier, let's put partisanship aside. But what they do is they bring us to the brink of this abyss, and then say, oh, but you folks, you don't want to work with us. Well, Mr. Speaker, we don't know what we got to work with. We do not have a budget. Now, the same government who told us and told the public that these measures that are in Bill 240 would be in the Financial Measures Act. That's where they were telling the public and telling other political parties that's where it's at. But all of a sudden, and one can only think it's done as a political maneuver as opposed to any real policy or legislative need, is they go and they say, look, here, we dare you, here's the line in the sand, we dare you to cross it. We offered today, like, show us this infamous budget. I mean, there's been much rhetoric hurled across the floor from the government today about what are you going to do for this? What are you going to do for that? How are you going to get the money for that? Well, really, in a lot of ways, nobody kind of knows, because the government has really not shuffled the cards. It's basically sealed the deck and hid it. What we want, and what Nova Scotians want, is a budget to see if you can be trusted. But we don't know what's in there. They're saying we're voting against a budget. Well, you know, Mr. Speaker, we're not. We're voting against the idea that they will not show Nova Scotians a budget. They do not trust Nova Scotians enough to have a budget in this House to be consultative about. You know, there is much talk that they're saying that the Finance Act wouldn't allow them to bring a budget in because of the situation as it relates to the Accord money. Well, Mr. Speaker, it allows them, and they know this very well, allows them through disasters, and one could say that the greatest disaster is that government over there, but in real terms, the disaster, we're looking at a financial disaster, Mr. I know. Well, you know, Mr. Speaker, truth hurts. But, you know, the fact of the matter is that truly there is a financial disaster. And that's what we could be looking at. But the government could have been consultative. But no, for reasons only known to them, and for reasons that most Nova Scotians understand, is that this is about forcing an election and trying to blame it on some other party, Mr. Speaker. This is not about fixing roads. It's not about getting money to farmers. It's not about helping the manufacturing sector, because nobody knows. Nobody knows. Well, the Premier's saying it's all about that. Well, why doesn't he give us a budget so we can decide what's in there? But he prefers not to do that. He prefers to think that he's coy, Mr. Speaker. And, you know, Nova Scotians are very much, I think they're on to him. And they realize the gamesmanship he's up to. And, you know, he's want to tell everybody that Nova Scotians don't want an election. Well, maybe they do, maybe they don't. But the fact of the matter is I don't know where he gets his information from. Maybe he doesn't, you know, hear completely what Nova Scotians are saying. But Bill 240 really is just a wedge bill that allows this group to go out and try to hoodwink, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians, to allow them to get out past the gate, run the election on a no-plan situation. You know, we heard it here yesterday. We hear the Premier telling people, if this House falls, there's no federal money. Well, that's not what Minister McKay said. Minister McKay said these are rock solid. These are going forward. We want to see timelines. You know, that's fine. But to go around and to give the illusion that these things will not happen if they're not at the throne of power, Mr. Speaker, and it's just not right to be telling Nova Scotians that, Mr. Speaker. We know that through Bill 240, it allows them to retroactively claw back money that they kind of spread around and were so financially irresponsible. Now they're trying to hide what they did, Mr. Speaker, and that's not right. And we want to debate that. We want Nova Scotians to know where your money's going. We want to know that there's, when there's a budget drawn up that we debate on, and there's a line item, and this is the amount, that's stuck to. And if there's a situation, if you will, that an extraordinary situation, or one of this financial disaster that says to us, well, look, there's something peculiar out there. We got to look into it. Well, why not do the statesman thing like the Minister of Finance said, and include the leader of the third party and the leader of the official opposition, and try to really move Nova Scotia forward. Tell it in an open way. Let everybody know. You know, it's springtime is here, Mr. Speaker. You know, it's for airing of stuff, Mr. Speaker. And isn't it great when we renew this, you know, Mr. Speaker? After just coming through the Lenten season and still in Easter, I don't know if the Premier really is worried about the Paschal mysteries or not. I don't know. But I got to tell you that this is really worrisome. Why doesn't he show Nova Scotians what he has, as opposed to this kind of Muhammad Ali rope-a-dope feature of going to different places and telling little bits of what's in the budget or what could be in the budget. And those bad guys over there want to support it. Well, you know, Mr. Speaker, the reality quite is this is the House of the people of Nova Scotia. This is where the budget should be laid and debated. But now all of a sudden, the Minister of Finance is saying he's prohibited by this. He's talked to constitutional experts. Didn't name the constitutional expert, but he talked to one. You know, did he talk to him walking down Hollis Street? Was it over at the office? Maybe he's at the gym one morning. You know, we don't know. But all of a sudden, they're going to this refuge. If we've talked to these people, and this is what they've told us. That's being really consultative. That's bringing the leadership of Nova Scotia involved and saying we've got to work to go forward. So when they say those words over there about working together and putting partisanship aside, Mr. Speaker, it rings very hollow to me. Very, very hollow. It certainly sounds that, you know, as the previous speaker, about large on rhetoric and little on fact. There's not one person, I would hope, that takes a seat in this House that their one objective in sitting in this House is moving Nova Scotia forward. And I believe that, and I believe we have differences around it. But when we're asked to say that we are standing in the way of some great government plan, but it's a secret plan, you know, Mr. Speaker, this type of talk is best kept in tin pot dictatorships almost, where we you know, we're told, well, you just vote for this. Everything will be all right. But, you know, after just coming out of celebrating 250 years of democratic representative government in this province, it seems really strange that government didn't buy into some of their own ideas. That why Nova Scotians and people that make up the majority amount of seats, Mr. Speaker, in this House, why this government that's on life support wouldn't come to them and say, look, we know that you represent more people in Nova Scotia than we do. So look, will you work with me? There was never a call to us, and there has never been in past governments, I may say, Mr. Speaker, since my time in the House, not as long as yours, but that when we were called upon, when Nova Scotia needed one voice, whether it was looking after the moving Halifax forward as the port for post-Panamax ships, we put that aside. We said, no, this isn't a job for partisanship. We went in one voice speaking for Nova Scotia because we knew what those jobs meant to this province. And when things come to these things, now the Premier's over there saying we're preventing jobs. Now, you know, that whining rhetoric is not going to get Nova Scotians any jobs. You know, Mr. Speaker, it's too bad that he wouldn't be the type of leader that would do what we've been asking for. It's not, you know, to do exactly what his finance minister just said should have been done. It's consultation. Don't blame our party, and really can't speak for the Liberal Party, but don't blame us for voting for something we haven't seen. Well, the member from Lake Bay said I can speak for them too. But you know what? Don't blame our parties and say you're holding things back and all these things that are out there that are not going to get done and all this. Show us. Show us. If he wants to, show us this great balanced budget. Because that's the other side here, that they're saying the balance, and that's the only thing in the Finance Act really says that the budget has to be balanced, and they're telling us it's balanced. So the idea of the Bill 240 really is a non sequitur, Mr. Speaker. The reality is that they know it's not balanced, and that they don't want the dirty little secret out there. So, Mr. Speaker, we want a Nova Scotia that's going to grow. We want a Nova Scotian that we know that the roads will get paved. We want people having meaningful work. You know, Mr. Speaker, we want ER doors open 24/7, Mr. Speaker. We want doctors in underserved areas. We want all of those things. And for anybody to get on their feet in this House and say that one party's against that, again, the argument is how you get there. But the fact of the matter is this government is sitting there with a minority House and saying, no, I'm running this shop like we're a majority. We're not consulting with you folks. We're not consulting with anybody. We're not going to consult with the Liberal Party. We're going to consult with the NDP, the official opposition here. No, what we're going to do is we're going to tell Nova Scotians that, look, they're bad. They're really bad because they're not going to vote for the Premier's unforeseen budget. You know, Mr. Speaker, I would like to see if that budget's even gone over to the Queen's printer yet. I wonder if he could tell us that. If it's even there, one has to wonder if it's not just on the back of a napkin somewhere, waiting to go over. How much of it is signed off by the Attorney General? We don't know. But Auditor General, excuse me. The idea that Bill 240 is the bridge to financial security for this province, Mr. Speaker, is almost laughable. Because we don't know where we're going with it. It's a piece of legislation that says, look, pass it. We got this plan. Now, 5 months ago, the government didn't have a plan. It didn't have a plan, you know, like to get people out of a snowstorm in the Cobequid Pass, and they didn't have a plan to get them out of this economic crisis, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, why should we believe them? Why will we, when we got a Premier that sits in his seat and refuses to substantively confer with leaders of other parties in a minority House? Why should we do that, Mr. Speaker? Why should we allow them any kind of support when they won't even tell the people of Nova Scotia what's in here? And the place you tell the people of Nova Scotia is in this House. The Minister of Finance has set forth his resolution that he can bring his budget forward, and we would be happy to see that budget. We would be happy to debate that budget. We would like to see what the estimates are. We would like to see real meaningful dollars and where they're going. But yet, he doesn't want to do that. You know, he talked about the 24-month window. Well, you know, Mr. Speaker, he knew about some of those windows and when they were closing last fall. And their cousins in Ottawa were letting the Department of Finance know. But yet again, the Premier kind of did his Alfred E. Newman, what me worry? That there was no problem here. There was no financial problem in this province. It was business as usual. Well, Mr. Speaker, as we know, you know, the Minister of Justice will tell you in his riding, where there's been a major layoff in the manufacturing section in his riding, that these are well-paid, meaningful jobs that's been hit and by this financial crisis. Yet there's almost seems like to the Premier's delight that's not a problem. That's not a problem. Well, Mr. Speaker, that is a problem. It's a problem for those people in Nova Scotia and Cape Breton that are losing good-paying jobs and and need reassurance that their government's going to look after them. We had a debate here last night on the economy, and I've got to tell you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll talk about in support of my colleague from Cape Breton Nova, and my friend from Cape Glace Bay, because I know the three of us spend a lot of time in Cape Breton representing our constituents at EI claims, and I'm going to tell you, they're not, the list for EI claims and problems aren't getting any shorter. Certainly, they're getting longer, and the problem is when even if you win now, if you win, the Commission will automatically appeal. 9 times out of 10, they will appeal. And all you're looking for many, many times, Mr. Speaker, is general wages that they would have lost. They're getting 2/3, and it would last, most of them, less than 40 weeks. And yet, what happens is the Commission will appeal it, and what will happen then, Mr. Speaker, is you'll sit and wait 6, 8, 10, sometimes as long as a year for a new hearing in front of an umpire who's usually a retired justice. And can you imagine, you're asking a family to go without any of that support for over a year. Yet I don't see anywhere that this government is, that doesn't seem to bother this government. I don't see them calling their federal counterparts and saying, you know, we've got a problem here, because when people will lose their jobs here, how are we going to support them? The fact is, it's access to training. That, you know, we would like to see something there, Mr. Speaker. A lot of people, it's really catchers catch can when you are trying to.
Order, please. The chair will recognize the Honourable the Minister of Economic and Rural Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, just to clarify a point, the Honourable Member mentioned that he doesn't see anyone of his colleagues cross the aisle from contacting the federal government. I want him to know that I have contacted the federal government and shared our disagreement with the long process that many people in this province are seeing in regards to applications for EI, and encourage them to speed up that process for all the reasons the Honourable Member is saying here today.
Thank you for that point of information. Chair recognizes the Honourable Member from Cape Breton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, 1 out of 20 ain't bad. Yeah. Well, you know, Mr. Speaker, but these are issues that aren't, well, you know, and I respect him for doing that, but it's something that government, the federal government, isn't listening to him on it, because it's happening, and the fact is that they haven't expedited a lot of these claims, and it's not, you know, I heard some of my colleagues yesterday saying that, you know, you get rid of the waiting times. Well, you know what? I would be just as happy if right now if they would stay to the waiting times. That when people apply for these this money or these premiums, that they have to wait. It's not uncommon to work 6 and 8 weeks just to get it okayed, and then you may have another 2 or 3 weeks if you refuse before you get a hearing in front of the Board of Referees. And then, like I said, if you go to the umpire, it's usually somewhere 6 months to a year, and that's a tough road to hoe, and that's part of this political disaster we live in. Yet, and Bill 240, we're asked to do this without seeing a budget, saying that what we're going to do through skills development and help a lot of these people that find themselves in this very hard done situation, Mr. Speaker. We really have taken a lot of heat the last day or so about people saying, you know, and the rhetoric flying around about election readiness. Well, you know, Mr. Speaker, I will stand up here today and say, absolutely. I mean, that there are people, it stands to reason that you have to get ready. If you keep hearing people saying that election's coming, well, you'd be, as a candidate, you'd be foolhardy not to get ready. And then for people to say, well, you're thirsting for this because you're getting ready. It's totally you have to be ready to fight an election that the Premier is so wanting to get involved with. So it's not about us being ready in an electoral cycle. It's about going back to what the Minister of Finance said about Bill 240 and about talking about his idea that we and the other opposition party are playing politics. And it's simply not true. The reality of this is it's a government, a minority government that, as we used to describe it, as one of the laziest governments in Canada that did not sit very often. We've gone 5 months without sitting, and we've been going through this, now I hear the agricultural minister, the minister responsible for free licenses for fishing license for seniors, going over, but we agreed to it.
That didn't happen, did it?
No, but he's talking about agreeing about it. And then you guys, it's at your will to come in. So it swings both ways. I guess, Mr. Speaker, you talk about, I suppose you shouldn't talk too much to the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal because you may get an infamous call late at night. So I'll leave that alone. So, Mr. Speaker, yeah. Mr. Speaker, back to Bill 241, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's...
Or 240.
240, Mr. Speaker. 240. But you know what, Mr. Speaker, it is. You know what, and talk about living in the past. You know what, Mr. Speaker, I did live in the past, Mr. Speaker, because I lived through the John Buchanan government. And I saw how people suffered. So, Mr. Speaker, sometimes it'd be good for all of us to realize about the past and all their friends and how people, and the deficits that were run up during that regime, Mr. Speaker. So we know these things. And I think it's valuable when you kind of, if you're riding a car or a semi-truck or whatever, Mr. Speaker, you should look in the rearview mirror every once in a while and see what's behind you. Because, Mr. Speaker, that was a particularly good time for Nova Scotia financially. It was really tough on a lot of families. And we don't want that. We don't want that level of indebtedness back on any of our children, Mr. Speaker. We want a province that will move forward. And what we want to see a budget. We want to see a budget that the government is saying is being stopped by the lack of support for Bill 240. But what we want to know is bring the bill forward, bring the budget forward, and then we can deal with it. But yet they want to lie, can you understand why just a few weeks ago they were going to put this type of legislation in the Financial Measures Act and then totally reverts itself and puts it as a standalone bill in front of the budget instead of behind the budget? Well, I'm only left with one conclusion, Mr. Speaker, and that conclusion, simply put, is it's political gamesmanship. It's not about the financial responsibilities. It's not about what's best for Nova Scotians. It's what they perceive. It's what's best for the life of their government, and trying to force an election, and then, in typical manner, trying to blame it on somebody else. So, Mr. Speaker, that I find that offensive, and I find that, that there's many of us in this House that would and I know our party are unanimous saying, show us the budget. Let's debate the budget. I mean, the Premier was out at various places in his off-season and telling them that he was going to present the budget and he was going to take it through to a vote. And I lauded him for that. That's good. But all of a sudden, he spins. He what's that term? Flip-flops. He flip-flops on it, Mr. Speaker, and all of a sudden, no, I don't want to do that. When being told of the details and I would say some unwise spending, he realized that he's in trouble trying to balance that book. So they're trying to claw back and do something as they like to say. This bill was good for 2005 but it's not good for 2009. So what else is not good for 2009 if you let these folks back at the public purse? What else would, you know, when a previous premier basically, I may be overstating a little bit, but staked his political career, if not his career, a great deal of his political capital on this bill. And so, as opposed to being prudent with the dollars outside of the Accord Fund, they spent them less than judiciously, Mr. Speaker. And now we have this bill who's saying, this was good for 05, just 4 short years ago, but it's no good for 09. It's no good. But with the promise, once we clean up this mess, we're going to go back on fixing the debt. Yet there's no date going back to that. When they would go back, it's pretty much an open-ended bill here in 240, Mr. Speaker. I don't see them saying this is the day we're going to go back and decide that we're going to get out of deficit spending. Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Environment on an introduction.
And I want to thank the honourable member for affording me this opportunity. It's always great to see Nova Scotians come in to view the operations of the House, and this afternoon I'm very pleased that we have a gentleman here from the Dartmouth area, Greg Beck, here to join us, and I was wondering whether Greg would like to stand up and receive a warm welcome to the House.
Thank you. The Honourable, the member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll be wrapping up shortly, Mr. Speaker, but I think it's important, though, that I say this once again, that we would have been much more and willing to get involved with meaningful consultation around this bill. You know, as I often draw experience on my time working in the labor movement, what I often do is say, you know, the worst thing you can do is put together an agreement at the 11th hour. What you want to give yourself as much room as possible, and to be able to look at all scenarios, and to allow everybody to see the fullness, and have many eyes look at the situation and say, you know, that this is the result over here, or this result over there, and you come together after that, and then what you do have as a true leader, you then have two options. You either say, look, I've garnered the input from all of these folks, and I've listened to you all, and I've realized that the staff, the information my staff gave me, and that's the road that I wanted to take originally, and that's the one I'm going to stay on. Well, that's fine, because it's been fully vetted and fully consulted, and at some point you are the leader. The other option would have been to take an amalgam of everybody else's ideas and move it forward. But what we find, as I've mentioned quite often in the speech on Bill 240, is that there's been no genuine consultation with other political parties, with people that represent the Nova Scotians from one end of this province to the other. They've been truly ignored, and it's all been done about political rhetoric and saying, if you don't support this, this is not going to happen, that's not going to happen, that's not going to happen. And you know what? If you're serious and if you're sincere about doing what's best for Nova Scotians in minority house, you work with the number of seats the people of Nova Scotia have given you, as opposed to ignoring them. This Premier, this party, has chosen to ignore the wishes of Nova Scotians, and I will tell you this, Mr. Speaker, before I sit down, that the people of Nova Scotia know this, and he will pay the price for that. Thank you.
The Honourable, the member for Richmond.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise to make a few brief comments on Bill number 240. Speaker, this affords me an opportunity as well, as the member for Richmond, to extend my deepest sympathies to the family of the late Honourable Mike Baker. Speaker, I had the opportunity to attend the funeral service in Lunenburg along with many colleagues from the House of Assembly. It was a very moving service and certainly a great testament to the commitment that Mike Baker had shown to his community, both as a lawyer and as a member of the House of Assembly and member of Cabinet. Speaker, making minority government work is never an easy task, and following the 2006 election, when I became interim leader of the Liberal Party, we had some very difficult decisions to make, and it took a significant amount of discussions in order to be able to move forward. I want to tell you, Mr. Speaker, that in all of the discussions that I had with Mike Baker as the government House leader, I can tell you that they were very fruitful and they were honest and frank discussions. And as elected officials, I think one of the best compliments that can ever be paid to us is that we are able to keep our word. And the one thing I can say is that in all of our discussions, Mike Baker was always able to keep his word. And I believe that's why this government has been able to survive in difficult times as a result of that. So certainly to his wife Cindy, to his parents, to his 2 boys and his extended family, my deepest sympathies in regards to his untimely passing. Mr. Speaker, I will not speak very long on Bill number 240. I believe that last night I gave a clear indication of what my position was and the frustrations that both I had and the residents of Richmond County had. And I believe that our leader earlier in the debate today set out quite clearly what the position of our caucus was in light of Bill number 240, and I don't believe that it bears repeating. But allow me just to say this again. The situation we find ourselves in economically is not unique to Nova Scotia, but the reaction that our province has had to this economic crisis is unique in the fact that we are the last legislature to sit. We are the last province to see an economic stimulus package. We are the last province to see a budget presented here in Canada. And for that, Mr. Speaker, there's no one who bears responsibility for that any more than the Premier of this province, and he is the one who will have to respond to the people of Nova Scotia for those decisions. Our leader has made it clear we will not be supporting Bill number 240, and as a result, I see no need to continue debate on this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable the Deputy Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and very pleased today to have an opportunity to speak to Bill 240. And essentially, Mr. Speaker, the question that is before the House is a question that deals with the issue of how do you spend a surplus, because the revenue that's generated from the offshore through the previous legislation was there was a requirement that that revenue be applied to the debt. In the time frame in which that legislation was passed in 2005, we in Canada and throughout the world were experiencing a very robust economy. The economic circumstances have changed drastically since 2005. The situation that government finds itself in is a situation of whether or not to continue applying the offshore revenue to debt and then to deal with all of the other circumstances that go with that. And what's been very interesting to date in this debate, in listening to the members of the opposition, is that they have focused entirely on process. They have focused on the process of when a budget can or cannot be presented. They have argued that this legislation is not necessary in order to present the budget. The legal opinion that the Minister of Finance has is an opinion that says we must have this legislation passed before a budget can be presented to the House. Unless, of course, Mr. Speaker, the House is prepared to go ahead and provide otherwise through unanimous consent. But the law is clear with respect to what you can or cannot do. So they have chosen, Mr. Speaker, to speak to process rather than deal with the issues that were very clearly articulated by the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal. And that is, if this money is not used as revenue to fund programs, if the $200 million plus that would be freed up is not used for that purpose, how then would they fund the programs? How then would they fund the stimulus package? How then would they allow Nova Scotia to take advantage of the federal government stimulus package so that we can increase our capital spending in this province in order to be able to take advantage of that? They have not addressed that question, Mr. Speaker. So I see your concern with the hour approaching, Mr. Speaker, and I want to, having put that question and that fact out there, that we have received nothing from the opposition parties with respect to how they would deal with the current situation, then, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians should understand that. Considering the hour, Mr. Speaker, I would move adjournment of this debate and look forward to continuing it again.
The Honourable the Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to rise today on a point of order. Mr. Speaker, the member from Halifax Atlantic earlier today tabled a resolution in this House. I can assure the House that a team of 3 water bombers from New Brunswick were on the scene for the Halifax fire and were able to make a significant impact. Mr. Speaker, I can also assure this House that that member deliberately misled this group. Mr. Speaker, I spoke with that member twice yesterday and brought that member up to speed on what was en route and what was happening as late as 6 o'clock last night. In fact, Mr. Speaker, the New Brunswick crew was here within 1 hour and 15 minutes after being called. That just re-emphasizes the professionalism of our firefighters in our region and the good partnership we have with our neighbors. Natural Resources continues to fight the fire on the ground and in the air, this morning with 5 DNR helicopters and several crew members. The New Brunswick fixed wing team is on standby if required. For the members' information, the safety of any personnel involved in such an incident is always of paramount importance. Currently, the ability of the weather conditions and the water bombers are important that our crews stay safe. Mr. Speaker, for the member of Halifax Atlantic to suggest that any member of this government, elected or otherwise, would do anything but put the lives of the residents of our emergency personnel at risk is unacceptable. And she was contacted. And Mr. Speaker, I would like to table a piece of the Chronicle Herald that shows the fixed air wing flying over that area.
Thank you. The Honourable, the member for the Opposition House Leader.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, first of all, the member from Halifax Atlantic acted on information that she had at the time, and I must also include that she is one of the people that have been evacuated, and it's been a very stressful time. And Mr. Speaker, but she was acting on information that was supplied to her this morning by another party.
Order, please. We are reviewing the resolution that was done earlier. We'll take this information into account, and we will move forward from that point. The Honourable, the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And further to the discussions before the House today, I'm rising to seek the indulgence of the House to consider a matter with regards to the budgetary process as it relates to Bill 240 and indeed the budget. As the members of the House would know, within the Provincial Finance Act, Section 76, in the law it states, the government, the minister, shall not table a budget in the House of Assembly that estimates a deficit, therefore the process. I can assure the House, Mr. Speaker, that as Attorney General, I've consulted with our constitutional advice. As the Government House Leader, I've sought the Chief Legislative Counsel advice. As you know, through your office, and Mr. Speaker, through your Chief Clerk, we've sought procedural advice with regards to the processes. And Mr. Speaker, for the purpose of transparency, we wanted to follow both the legal as well as the legislative processes. However, it is the prerogative of this House, Mr. Speaker, if it so chooses, and it is the desire of this government that the Minister of Finance be enabled and provided the opportunity to present his budget in its full form before the House, as prescribed in our rules and forms of procedures, pages 64 and 65, pursuant to the resolution the Minister presented yesterday. So, Mr. Speaker, with that point, I would ask for the unanimous consent of the House to allow the Minister of Finance to present his budget in its full form to this House Monday of next week, Mr. Speaker, and that following that debate and the responses, that we would come back to the debate on Bill 240, which, Mr. Speaker, to maintain the integrity of the law, but also respect the ability of this House to know the context of what the budget that the Minister is presenting and has created much debate would allow it to proceed. And, Mr. Speaker,